You're listening to Bad Dog Agility, bringing you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah.
And I'm Jennifer.
And this is episode 205.
This podcast is brought to you by HitItBoard.com. HitItBoard.com has the innovative training tools you need for agility. Having problems with the dog walker A-frame? The HitItBoard can fix that. Your dog doesn't like tugging? They'll love the Tug It. Can't move your A-frame around by yourself? The Move It can. Go to hititboard.com and use discount code BDA10 to get 10% off your order. That's hititboard.com.
Today's podcast is also brought to you by Elite Science. Unlock your dog's full potential with the unique competitive edge solution, 1TDC. 1-tetradecanol complex is a patented blend of unique fatty acid oils designed to safely and effectively keep joints and muscles at their best to maximize performance and shorten recovery time. 1TDC is the next generation of fatty acids and is used by many current and past national agility champions and world team members. All of our listeners will automatically qualify for a great 1TDC special offer by purchasing online at BDA1TDC.com. That's BDA, the number 1, TDC.com. Today we have 5 tips for consistent contact criteria. And this podcast comes to you because we are currently working with all of our VIP students on contacts for the entire month of September. And the 3 of us have got contacts on the brain. We've been answering contact questions all month. And so we kind of put together a list of some of the most common questions, things that we had to think through and explain, and some tips that we came up with along the way. So the first and most important, I think, tip is to know your criteria. This is kind of step 0, really. It's the prerequisite for everything that you're going to do in your contact training. And one thing that we had people do was write it out on paper.
I think this is a really important one, and it's easily and often overlooked. So people often say, especially for stop contacts, they say, well, my criteria is 2 on, 2 off. And I say, okay, 2 on, 2 off. What if your dog moves into position and they're crooked? Their 2 rear feet are on, their 2 front feet are on the ground, but they are definitely crooked, like 45 degrees or more, and they're looking at you. Is that acceptable or not? The handler always stops for a moment and they have to think. So they don't know right away, and that's going to be reflected in their training. Do they reward? Do they not? Sometimes there's a delay. Sometimes they reward that position, but other times they don't. That's the kind of confusion that's going to get you in trouble. Another good example is, what happens when your dog assumes that position and then they sit there and they bark at you?
That's exactly
right?
the one I was going to ask.
That, or are you not reinforcing that? I'll just tell you very quickly that being crooked and barking are both acceptable to me specifically as a trainer. I just don't find it an issue. Other people are going to choose not to reward those. Again, the problem happens when you sometimes reward it and you sometimes don't.
And I love, as an instructor, asking the question, just like you mentioned, challenging the student to really think through what their criteria is. I'll a lot of times get the same thing. The student will oversimplify what they want. And if I ask questions like you mentioned, is it okay if they're crooked? What is their release? Is it the first word you say? Is it a specific word? What if they creep down into position? The handler will say, 2 on, 2 off. Well, what if it takes them 8 seconds to get there? Is that okay? So I think really challenging the student to think through will help them clarify things all before they get started, and writing it down, having it clear in their head. Another one I get is, well, I want my dog to run through the contact. Well, that can be so open-ended and that can be so vague. And a lot of times, we talk about with students, I'll talk about the difference between, okay, are we going to have a trained running contact, or are we simply going to allow the dog to not stop? And I know it kind of seems similar to think, okay, well, a running contact versus a non-stop. But in my mind, the difference is kind of the how much criteria we're going to put on it. Are we going to have a very systematic approach? Maybe we're paying attention to, are the back legs split? Is the head staying down? Maybe we're going to train it with a mat. And traditionally, we think of those trained running contacts as an acceleration down the board. But I'll also have students who maybe have a really large, slower moving breed, a Bernese Mountain Dog, an Irish Wolfhound, or a lot of times the opposite, the really small dogs who they don't necessarily need to train it, but they don't want to ask for a stop. They don't want a 2-on, 2-off. So they're doing what I call more of a non-stop, where maybe as a handler, they'll slow down near the end of the board and the dog will decelerate a little bit. They're not training a 2-on, 2-off, but they're not training specific criteria. So even separating those two apart is I think, really important for people to think about.
All right. So 3 out of 3 instructors on this podcast think that knowing your criteria is critical. So the second tip that we have is, this is something actually that Jen brought up that I hadn't really heard of very many people doing this before. And that was training with a solid colored board. So tell us why you have moved some of your training to a solid colored board, Jennifer.
So how this came about is in working with a couple students who have the running contacts, is I would see them do maybe 2 or 3 or 4 repetitions of a dog walk, and watching the dog, I was seeing something different every time. I was seeing different footwork, different striding, different body position. And what I would observe is that the handler would reward or acknowledge performance only on whether or not the dog was in the yellow. And I don't think the dog was aware that there was a color. The dog wasn't trained to hit the yellow. The dog wasn't trained to look for a change in color. The dog was doing different things, getting rewarded or not rewarded, not based on their criteria or their body language, but just yellow or non-yellow. So I threatened one of my students. I said, I'm going to get you a solid color board and I'm going to make you really watch your dog. And that's exactly what I did. I went out, I had a 12-foot dog walk board made, rubberized, solid blue, no contact zone. And it required them to then actually be paying more attention to what the dog was trained to do, what the dog was supposed to do, and what the footwork was in this case. And I actually carried that over and trained that with my own dog as well. My youngest dog, I put a running dog walk on, and I did not want to be skewed and thinking, oh, well, she was leaping at the end, but she was in the yellow, so that was okay. If I don't want leaping, I don't want leaping. So I trained on my solid blue board so that I personally wouldn't be skewed in thinking, well, she jumped at the end of the board, but she was in the yellow, so that's okay. I wanted to be as consistent as I could with what my criteria was.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I don't think that everybody out there needs to go get a solid colored board. It's a lot of work. Maybe it's something that you don't have access to if you train on other people's equipment. But I think the idea that you bring up, that you should not simply be looking at the contact zone and basing everything off of that. I think that's super valuable. And I think if people take that idea and reevaluate how they are watching contacts, they can improve their training.
I really love it. And I just want to point out that a lot of high-level competitors from around the world are already doing this, even in the classes that they teach, as it relates to running dog walks specifically. They are looking for situations in training where one front foot hit might be an R reward, two, or even a non-reward, right? A one paw, one front foot hit might be a non-reward. And then you might have a reward be 2 front feet. And then if they get you 1 or 2 back feet, then it's like a jackpot, right? And in all of these cases, the dog is in the yellow, but certain hits are more desirable than other hits, because there's the thought that ultimately it's going to give you a higher percentage of correct performance in the ring. And I'll give you one comparison example, and that would be jumping, keeping bars up. So let's say, for example, that you're rewarding every time your dog takes a jump and doesn't drop a bar. What about those times your dog hits the bar, but the bar doesn't come down? Right. We've all had that experience. And in general, I would say that given the choice, you would want to not reward that, right? You don't want that behavior becoming part of your dog's repertoire. Why? Because then they're more likely to drop the bar, right? That time that the bar decides to fall down and not rattle and stay in the cup. And it's the same thing here with the contacts. Certain hits, even though they are in the yellow, are conducive to leaping or missing. Sure, they got it this time, but in general, or the majority of the time, they're going to miss, and that's what Jennifer's talking about. So it's really an important point to make that I think a lot of people don't think about.
All right, so tip number 3, if you have a stop, know the difference between a quick release and an early release. And again, we're getting into the semantics of language here, but I think that a lot of people when they take a 2-on, 2-off into competition, and now it's a big competition. They want the fastest performance possible. Whether you see the dog hit that 2-on, 2-off and then immediately release, that would be a quick release. You see the hit and then you release. You just
the
don't
criteria
wait.
has been met.
Right. You just don't wait that 1 to 2 seconds that you might wait in a regular weekend trial. So, and then let's compare that to an early release. Jennifer, how would you define an early release?
Yeah, an early release, as Esteban just said, is going to be before the dog meets criteria. So in the situation of a 2-on, 2-off, we're talking about a dog who is released the moment a toe is in the yellow. You know, we see this a lot at the bigger events, the events where people are pushing for speed, maybe a nationals or an international event. So the dog never actually met the criteria, but was released off the board. And I think it's easy to think these two are the same things, but one, the dog met criteria and was released quickly, and one, the dog never met criteria. And I think the confusion between these two from trainers is one of the big things that causes a lot of creeping on contacts. You know, the dog is released prior to hitting the 2-on, 2-off. So the next time they go a little slower, going, well, how about now? Well, how about now? How about now? So I really try to make sure, hey, you're not getting released till those front feet hit. And if the dog learns over many years, okay, got to get the front feet to the ground, there's no reason to creep. We can drive right into position. So, definitely something to clarify both as a trainer and then really watch out for.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that we see with students is that people have the impression that when their dog creeps, they need to encourage the dog by releasing them early to get extra speed and drive. So, they need to let them go. But what you're actually doing is introducing confusion, and then that confusion translates into the dog being even more hesitant.
Yeah, totally agree on that.
Yeah, you basically have more than one behavior satisfying the problem, right? So if the problem is 2 + 2 = what? Before it was always 4, and now it's 4 or 5 or 6. And so the dog really doesn't know what answer to offer you. Do I stop here early? Do I get into my 2-on, 2-off? Both of these have been reinforced in the past. So definitely all of those things are true. I do want to point out that if you are a handler where your dog is definitely going to go faster on an early release, it is perfectly okay to use an early release at a big competition. Hopefully you only have a handful of big competitions, finals, in a given year, because then you can use kind of the history of your reinforcement to overcome that one incorrect reinforcement. Because think about it in training, right? We make lots of mistakes where you inadvertently reward something you didn't mean to reward. Is it a big deal? Are we going to fall apart and go crazy because we ruined our dog forever because one time we clicked when the dog was doing something bad, like barking at someone else or something? No, we don't worry about that because of all the repetitions that we're rewarding where the dog's doing the right thing. So the same thing happens here. Occasionally at a trial, you are going to see things wrong. Your dog's going to stumble. You think they hit it, and instead they completely missed the contact. You rewarded it. You moved on, or whatever. These things happen. And you can do this quite intentionally. So like Jennifer mentioned, you get to a big event, you want to do it. The problem really comes in when you're doing it at a high enough frequency where it does cause that confusion. And different dogs have different tolerances for that. So a lot of people, they don't just do it in the final. They also do it in round 1, round 3, the challenge round, the final. So now in one weekend, they've done it 4 out of 5 times they see a dog walk. Okay, well, now you're going to have to invest a little more practice time and local trial time to kind of undo or overrule or cancel out that reinforcement, however you want to put it, however you want to think about it. We're not saying that we're morally opposed to you ever doing it. There's a good reason to do it, right? If you have a dog where you do that and you save 0.3 of a second, that 0.3 of a second could be the difference between getting a ribbon, getting 3rd in the finals, and getting 8th, right? That's how tight some of these final events are. So, again, not wrong or right for that one moment. Just be aware of how it impacts your dog's performance in the future. So that in general, I'm going to say, hey, you do 99 times out of 100 pretty much over the course of a year, need to be waiting for that foot to hit. And in reviewing a video, which, we're going to talk about shortly, spoiler alert.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah, a little foreshadowing there. It is one of the most common errors I see when people are retraining contacts. They don't wait till they actually see the 4th foot, which would be the 2nd front foot, hit the ground. They anticipate it. So they do it when it's in the air or still on the board.
I'll be the first to tell you that 3 weeks from now, when I'm at the World Championships, you will be seeing me do early releases. When I see a toe in the yellow, we are releasing and we are going to be gone. So those early releases can be totally appropriate. But the flip side of that is just earlier today, I was at a local AKC show and we did not even receive a placement in standard because when Swift came down to the contact, I made him wait in his 2-on-2 off. I took a deep breath. I raised my arm. I let out. And I wanted to make those deposits so that I know when I step to the line at the World Championships that I will be able to do those early releases and kind of counterbalance when I'm doing it, saving it for the big events, and then reinforcing them at a local show. So 100% agree with what you're talking about there.
Yeah, great point. And cautionary tale for the beginners. The high-end handlers over here like Jennifer, they're using these local trials before these big events to kind of beef up their contact behavior. So it's something that they plan. They're not thinking about just one particular run and one particular ribbon. They really are thinking about several competitions and what their dog is going to do over a period of time.
So now as we're talking about these stops and the difference between the quick release and the early release, another thing talking about releases off of contacts for those who do have the stops is a release in motion versus a release with motion. Now, again, we're talking about a little bit of verbiage here and kind of really listening and understanding the difference. But a release in motion is exactly what it sounds like, where the handler will be moving, whether it be a walk, whether it be a jog. And just as you're moving, you give your release. So you would say break or you would say tunnel or whatever your next release word. These are what I love to see. But what I often see happening, and I think, we've seen these in the video reviews of our contact work, is handlers doing a release with motion. Now, what this is when the handler would come down and stop at the end of a contact or decelerate at the end of a contact and then give the release word with the motion. So right as they step away, right as the arm goes up. And while you can sit there and say, well, yes, I did give my release word, sometimes it's easy to see that maybe it wasn't the dog releasing on the verbal, but actually the change in motion. Is this something that you guys have seen with students?
Absolutely. So many times it happens at the exact same moment. And from the dog's perspective, there are two legitimate cues for the release. Why would the dog pick the verbal over the physical when they both happen every single time they release off the contact? They're just as likely to view that motion as the release cue.
Yeah, so there's a very easy way to check it. Everyone can do it. So just go out to the practice field, have your dog, do whatever contact obstacle you're going to have them do. And then when they move into your position and you've come to a stop, right, then you just jump forward, leap forward.
Start running again.
Yeah, just start running again. And the vast majority of dogs are going to come off with you. And
right, they're going to use that motion.
Yeah, especially in a trial situation. And it's really tricky, as you point out, because there are dogs who can even so finely discriminate that when their handler runs at a steady state, they know it's like a test. My handler's running in motion. I'm going to go on the verbal only. But then the times the handler chooses to slow down and decelerate, they said, I'm going on the body. Right. So a dog can discriminate even that finely. And so you need to be very careful about weeding it out in your practices so that the release cue is pure and it's purely verbal.
I think it is not just about the release cue being pure, like you said. I think that's really important. But I think that there is a nuance here that most competitors are not understanding, and that is how many mistakes that happen after contacts are not due to the handling that happened after the contacts. They're due to that stop and restart and how close the handler is to the dog. So many times, if the handler stops in 2-on-2 off and the handler is right next to the dog, then when the handler says, okay, for the briefest moment, there is no indication of what should be next. So some dogs are a little bit slower or a little bit more in tune with their handler. They're going to wait for that next command. So you say, okay, tunnel, and they come off the contact and go take the tunnel. There are other dogs, the moment you say, okay, they bolt in a direction that may or may not be correct. And even if you say, okay, tunnel, if they bolt on the okay and they whip around your body or they curve towards you, they're no longer on the right path for that tunnel. So many mistakes happen after the contacts because the handler is right next to the dog. So if you can either release in motion. So don't release your dog as soon as they hit 2 on 2 off. Pass them as you run towards the next obstacle. In this example, it's the tunnel, so that you have motion that supports your next cue, which is tunnel. And then the alternative is a lot of handlers, they need to stop right next to the dog to help the dog get the contact. So understanding that, after your dog has stopped, take one or just even one step forward before you release the dog puts you a couple of feet in front of your dog with some motion in the new direction, which will help your dog get whatever's next.
I love that you brought this up because I think that's so true. I get videos all the time. What did I do wrong in my handling? And it's like, a jump or two after a contact. And I look at it and I say, well, your handling wasn't the problem. What was your problem? Started back at the contacts. And even just today, I saw exactly what you're describing. It was teeter, jump, jump. The handler stopped at the end of the teeter, had no motion, released and moved forward. And the dog was so quick that it went over the jump. She's now behind. Dog curled in towards her and got a refusal at the next jump. If she had just been able to stay in motion off that teeter, she never would have had the decel in that location behind the dog that ended up cueing that inadvertent refusal.
Absolutely. And that will bring us to tip number 5, which is to film yourself both in training and trials. So this will give you 2 different pieces of information. First of all, it will let you see whether you are really getting the contact performance that you have trained and that you expect from your dog. So many people think that they did not release early, that their dog met criteria before they gave the release, that their dog waited for that break command. And if you look at the video, that's not what happened. Maybe they had 1 foot down on the ground, but they never got that second foot down. Maybe as we're talking, this handling stuff that happens after, when you look at it on video review, you say, absolutely, my dog's line changed the moment I said okay, and I wasn't in a position to handle what came next. All of that you will find when you look at it on video review.
Yeah, it's easy to get excited, to feel the adrenaline, whether it's training, whether it's trialing, maybe your instructor's pushing you to focus on a handling. You think you saw something, and having those videos to go back, I think, is so helpful. And I see people video a lot in trials, but video the training too. I just had a seminar where I said, your dog only stopped all 4 on and then you released. And they just honestly looked at me and they said they did. They didn't even know it happened, but they had no video to go back on. So important to be filming those runs.
Completely agree. I think both of you know I'm big on videoing. So
that's right. Yeah, that is not new information, but in the context of contacts, I think is really important. All right. Well, those are our 5 tips for consistent contact criteria. Go back and think about if there are any of these tips that are not incorporated into your training and how you can use them to get better contact performance from your dog. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Elite Science and hititboard.com. Happy training.
What do you call cheese that's not yours? Nacho cheese.